It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening for an artist talk and reception in conjunction with Christian Ruiz Berman's first museum exhibition, Hortus Inconclusus. Other solo exhibitions of his has been presented at Calderon Gallery in New York, Mindy Solomon Gallery in Miami, Florida, and Martha's Contemporary in Austin, Texas. Ruiz Berman's work has also been featured in several important group exhibitions, The Pit in Los Angeles, Future Gallery in Berlin, and Anat Ebgi Gallery in Los Angeles, among many others. Most recently, his work was presented along Jodi Manaya, another artist who's had one of her first big exhibitions here at the museum as part of our Atrium project, and now has 4 gorgeous photographs that are part of our collection in the main gallery. Christian's work was on view with hers most recently at the Armory Show in New York in September. So really exciting. That large-scale painting is here, correct? Mm-hmm. So we're lucky to have that just, right out of the studio, kind of an exciting time to see what Christian's working on. Ruiz Berman earned a BA from Duke University, an MLA in landscape architecture from RISD, along with a graduate teaching certificate and an MFA from RISD. Based in New York, Ruiz Berman's paintings and sculpture draw from personal histories of migration and adaptation, with broad stylistic influences including Japanese printmaking and tragicomic nature of mariachi bands and Mexican folklore, as well as Indigenous, European, and Tibetan Buddhist symbology. Remixed with the traditions of abstraction, realism, and trompe l'oeil, Ruiz Berman creates detailed, fascinating, and complex compositions that encourage to examine stereotypes of eroticism or ideas of the commonplace, and what is authentic and fabricated within these enclosed garden-like scenes. You probably have already done this, but I definitely would take a close look, because the immaculate kind of fine eye and painting is not to be missed within these compositions, and the attention to texture is something that's really exceptional. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Christian Ruiz Berman.
Thank you. I just want to start by thanking all the same people that Aaron just thanked. It's really an amazing opportunity to be able to do this. Especially want to thank Joel Jackson for helping to make this all happen. And good to be back in Missouri. I was living in St. Louis for about 1.5 years, and I really like being back in this general vicinity. And I'm pretty amazed to see so many people here. It makes me very nervous, but hopefully I can get through this semi-coherently. So I think as a painter, it's always a little bit awkward for me to try to explain my work or talk about my work, because I think as painters, most of us sort of get into this practice as a way to communicate non-verbally and to sort of connect with people in a way that's very different than trying to explain things or trying to lay things out in a verbal fashion. So I think mostly I'll scroll through some of the work that I've been doing and kind of explain where it came from as best as I can. But I also really like questions and talking to people one-on-one or fielding any questions that people have in the audience. So hopefully we can do a little bit of that. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoy the exhibition. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm excited to get out there with you guys afterwards and see it. Okay, so. I'm going to start just by reading this poem that I wrote. Poetry is very important to me as part of my practice and sort of just a way of thinking as well. So I'll just get into it. Self. I look for myself in the recesses of my own irises, in the violet petals of a hyacinth, in the eyes of others, and in the last convulsions of a rainbow trout. It was not wondering what it was, but simply thrashing to live. What a strange thing to find myself in all these things, and also only in a thought. So poetry has always been sort of my most private pursuit, but as I expand my painting practice and kind of navigate a time in history when technology is depersonalizing almost every aspect of existence, poetry for me represents a very basic and essential desire to challenge my own preconceptions and sort of to attempt generosity and connection. So let's, I think painting for me is one way to just ask questions that necessarily don't have a very good answer. And so it's sort of just a corollary to living every day and sort of taking in the world and asking what it's all about, sort of knowing that probably no conclusions will ever come to me, but it's the asking of the questions that really matters. And as I make a painting, my process involves sort of trying to let everything in that I've experienced. I think as someone who sort of started painting later than some people, I have a lot to draw from, and I've lived in a lot of places, seen a lot of things, and I don't necessarily sit down and sort of write all those things down and try to make a statement, but I try to let those things kind of filter into the practice and sort of speak for themselves in a way and tell their own stories. So one sort of big question or big concern that I find myself coming back to very often is this notion of everything's being a process and everything being in a constantly changing state and sort of in flux, and then also our need to sort of identify or to say this is this, that is that, and to make sense of life basically by breaking down those processes. And that to me in life is maybe the biggest paradox and sort of what I end up coming back to all the time, this sort of like wave particle duality where, you know, if you look at what your self is or what your body is or what anything is, it's really a series of events or a series of happenings or processes. But then we can't really function within that reality without identifying and breaking down things and sort of placing importance on this thing or the other thing, and that's also necessary. So a lot of the paintings sort of mirror this kind of duality and this paradox. This one is a very simple little abstract piece that I did, which I've made a bunch of. So these two paintings also kind of mirror that, the preoccupation with that paradox. So you have, a lot of the times when I start a painting, I'll start with a very loose set of brush strokes or brush strokes and sort of just start from sort of a more meditative or rhythmical or intuitive beginning where, you know, I'm basically just pushing paint around or selecting colors and trying to find, a lot of times I'll actually play music and play different kinds of music and see how that changes the flow of the paint or the rhythm of the way the work is going to go. And then after that, I start to insert narrative or to, you know, think about the meaning of a song or a certain mythology or fairy tale. And these two paintings are kind of a simple version of that, where there's not really a specific tale or story, but it's more about that state of flow and that state of change sort of in conjunction with very specific animals or objects or moments of focus. I'll try in this presentation to just show some things that have inspired me and some of the things that I look at. So these are tantric paintings from Rajasthan, which I find really fascinating. So again, it's sort of allowing work to move the process and sort of things to unfold on their own, but then also honing in on intentions at the same time. So these are paintings that people do as part of a meditative practice. And they're meant to sort of represent different meditative states or different modes of focus or like things that the meditator will focus on in order to gain greater understanding. But there's this wonderful looseness and abstraction and like universality to the paintings that really anybody can connect to, even if you're not, you know, versed in that practice. So I sort of started making art around 2012, at least in the serious way, where I wanted to show it and be in studio all the time. So that was, I moved to Brooklyn around that time, and around that time, a lot of people were doing sort of this, what they call provisional painting, and it was very, very loose and sort of sloppy and interesting, but like kind of not very craft-based or like detail-based. And as part of my practice, I've always also seen it as sort of a game, and I've always liked to find new things to do or things that other people aren't doing or ways to surprise people. Like I think art becomes very stale and meaningless for me if I'm not trying to create pleasure or surprise or just something new for the viewer, which I think in a weird way is very rare these days. Like, I talk to a lot of people who are trying to make a specific statement or trying to, support a certain cause or to develop a certain style, but I hardly ever hear someone say, oh, I want to inspire delight, or I want to inspire joy. So I think we need more of that, and that's sort of something that I've always aimed at. So I just wanted to do something really different when I started out, and I started using feathers and porcupine quills and strange materials, and sort of did very nitpicky sort of sculptural stuff, just because I thought it would be strange and different. And I also find that when I make a work, I need that moment where I don't know what I'm doing and the materials are doing what they want to do. Like, for me, that without that, the work is very uninteresting if I'm controlling every aspect of it. So working with plaster was one way to sort of make something and have that sort of like unwrapping a Christmas present moment where the plaster comes out or you undo the mold and you have this thing and it's taken on a life of its own. So it's always been that balance of like playing with the material and then what my intentions are and sort of going back and forth. So these ones, that's all macaw feathers, like the yellow and the red parts in those circles. And it's very, it's a sculptural relief, so it has some depth to it. So we'll kind of circle back a little bit to poetry here. When I started sort of painting more and thinking about getting an MFA and like thinking about what my work is about, I was fascinated by the fact that the way that I wrote poetry or the way that poets work seemed to me to have this correlation with painting, and that the way that the elements sort of like fit together had an openness to it. And it connected with me in a way that like reading artist statements or listening to descriptions of art like didn't quite connect with me. And so I started looking back through history to see if there were any examples of poets making paintings or painters making poets, or that dialogue existing between those two mediums. And I found that in ancient Greece, they talked about the sort of the connections between the two a lot. But it took me reading about basically Japanese art forms to find a very direct correlation between the two, where people were actually making the two at the same time and really speaking about it, which is interesting to me. And that's, in Japan, there's an art form called surimono, where basically in sort of these higher society clubs or gatherings, people would get together to make prints or paintings, and then they would also write poetry about them. So they would have poets and painters in the same space, sort of sharing ideas, and maybe somebody would make a print, and then 5 different people would write a poem about it. So this is an example where there's 3 different poems written about this one artist's work. And then also within the paintings, there were a lot of like inside jokes and sort of references to the artists or to the different poets or things or news that were happening during the day. And I found that also really interesting, in that there could be this dialogue between different kinds of artists and between the written word and also paintings. So I think a lot of my paintings have drawn inspiration from not only the kind of space making that happens in Japanese printmaking and painting, because it has this, even being so old, it has this sort of feeling of breaking down realities or sort of flattening spaces in a way that also felt like of the moment to me. But it's also concerned with this sort of like play on words or like connection between poetry and painting. And then sometimes I make videos. This one I'll play because I feel like I made it a while ago, but it seems to just gain relevance the more time passes. So I'll just play it. So that's that. So yeah, obviously I enjoy wordplay and humor, and I think I'm really attracted to humor as just sort of a destabilizing element and a way to shake people up and get them thinking about things in a different way. And also by the ways that technology is sort of forcing us to rethink all our connections and interactions, and kind of instead of sort of blindly following that and just sort of going along with this wave of how it affects us, to really look at these objects and machines and sort of different ways of connection and question them and sort of figure out like what works and what doesn't work in a way I think is interesting to me and probably important. So I'm really excited by a work's potential to inspire new narratives. And I don't often define each image or symbol within a painting or drawing in terms of a comprehensive narrative. Instead, I usually engage with a process of partial improvisation to allow the paintings to speak to one another and to communicate outside of themselves. So there's a lot of sort of like entanglements and connections and threads in my work. And I really want them to function as a shared experience. And I guess you could say that any painting by nature of just existing kind of implicitly becomes a shared experience, but I think that there are ways of painting that allow for a wider range of entry points for the viewer. I was reading, before I was making these paintings, I was reading a lot of philosophy by Karen Barad and Donna Haraway, who are two sort of contemporary feminist philosophers, and who talk about basically the apparatus a lot and about ways of looking beyond sort of an anthropocentric, hierarchical, bottom-up, top-down sort of way of thinking, and to start to think in a way that considers sort of entanglements between things and relationships between things as really the defining aspects of our reality. And so a lot of times in my paintings, the animals or the objects or the threads really become central players and sort of the central focus of the narrative, and the people or the stories kind of become lost in a sort of in-between time or in a nondescript kind of universe where the power of the human or the individual is sort of taken away or at least questioned, and animals are often kind of mischievous. Like in this one, the lemon is sort of the focus of the action. And I started to get into malaphors, which are basically idioms that are improperly mixed together. And to me, it felt like a very personal thing, because being an immigrant from Mexico and also having a mom who's an immigrant and mixes expressions together all the time, I thought it was is pretty funny, and then also it again has this way of like opening up questions or opening up the reality of things, or asking you what matters and what doesn't. And sort of, if somebody tells you an idiom and it's sort of taken for granted, you don't really think about it. It sort of just kind of like blows past you. But if somebody confuses it and kind of mixes two things together, then you start to think, oh, where did those things come from? You know, like why do people say this? So here, the title for this one is When You Live in a Glass House, Make Lemonade. I think that was the first malaphor painting that I did, and then I started to make more. So here are just some more examples of them. These are more recent, I think, from the past year or so. So you can catch more birds with honey than with a stick. This one's not a malaphor, but it's finding your marbles. Two can play that game. These ones are not malaphor paintings, but these ones, again, sort of like feature birds as I think birds are really interesting to me because in all my paintings, I'm sort of challenging where we are in time, where we are in space, and then like what's real and what's not. I find it really enjoyable that a lot of people think my paintings are collaged, or they ask me like which part of the painting is a photograph, or like if I collage wood veneer on there, and like what's real and what's not, and just the play of making everything out of paint and having that be a moment of surprise is fun for me. And then birds, I think, fit into that sort of game because, especially in Mexican mythology, the hummingbird and other birds are often the creatures that take people from one world to another, or that sort of are the in-between, can sort of like exist in in-between spaces, obviously because they can fly, and across cultures, not just in Mexico, have always been a symbol of being able to transcend certain worlds or certain narratives. So I think that's part of the reason that they started to come into my paintings. And I was also like a pretty avid bird watcher when I was a little kid, so it's just a way to sort of build that thread up too. So these two paintings kind of deal with the erotic and again, birds sort of like taking the place of humans as kind of weaving this narrative of like reality, not reality, appropriateness, non-appropriateness, like things being bound together or pulled apart. And I've started to also use symbols and objects and sort of archaeologies from a wide range of cultures. When I started, I mainly used Mexican archaeological elements. And then I started to realize, even though that's an important part of my upbringing, like I started to get kind of wary of everybody kind of identifying themselves so tightly and making all their work about like, oh, I'm from Mexico, oh, I'm from India, like, and this is what my work is about. And like, for me, that's never what it's been about. Like being from another country and being from Mexico is always kind of going to filter into my work, and I can't avoid that. But the work is really more about finding common threads and like common importance in storytelling and sort of like shared humanity and kind of bigger questions. So I think it's interesting to find these sort of like more universal symbols of, for instance, in these paintings of eroticism or what have you, but like the remix is what's important to me. And I think in culture, appropriation often is what makes culture. I think it's a very unavoidable thing. And to me, when you have conversations about like what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, or when should you take something or when should you not take something, to me it's more about respect. And you know, would never be out there to make fun of somebody's culture or to misrepresent it or to sort of step on it or you know, I think as in all of life, it's like you have to navigate other people and other places and other influences, and you have to do that in a way that it's honest and that's productive. And the way to do it is not to just avoid taking any influence from anywhere or talking about any other culture, because then you're just kind of like shutting yourself into a tighter and tighter box, which I think is happening a lot these days. So here we'll just go to narrative a little bit, which is always important to me, as I've already said. I just want to give a couple like specific examples in paintings so you get an idea of sort of how I work. So the painting on the left is called Chained Like Chalmol, and this one comes from a story in Mexico where there was basically a princess, and this is a Mayan story. And there was a princess who had a lover. She was a young princess, and her father did not want her to be with that man. Sort of that age-old story of unrequited love, and sort of the father choosing a different person for somebody. So the father wanted her to marry this other warrior who was more famous or more rich or what have you. And he wanted her lover to be put to death so that she wouldn't be thinking about him. So she went to the local witch doctor and the witch doctor turned her lover into a beetle that she could wear basically on her lapel and have him with her the rest of her life. And if you go to the Yucatan in Mexico, they still do this. So that's a picture of the beetle, the actual beetle in the bottom left there, which they kind of bedazzle with like plastic rhinestones, and then the women will actually wear them on a little chain. So that painting is sort of about that story, and you know, there's different elements in there that hint at what's what, and you can kind of like place yourself into that scene. And then the one on the right, I also have a lot of ancestors from who are Celtic, because a lot of my ancestors were from northwest Spain. So I was looking into Celtic stories a little bit, and there was a goddess named Rhiannon, and she was said to have 3 birds with her all the time. And if you encountered these birds, they would sort of warp time and space where people would get really lost and sort of like fall asleep or not know where they were, and then kind of be lost. And it was sort of one of her powers. So, and they were called the Adar Rhiannon. So this painting is a representation of those birds. And then sometimes this piece is actually in the show here, so I wanted to just show this one. And this one sometimes I get a little bit more political, and this one speaks about the allure and also the unattainability of the classic American dream. So there's a brown hand symbolizing possibly the immigrant who has maybe made it and is dangling a string of pearls. And Maybe you question, are the pearls a genuine path to wealth? Are they borrowed? Are they bait for a trap? And a black mouse and a white mouse wait below, looking for a way out of the maze. Everything is entangled in America's present as an abstracted avatar, both a stage for the scene and also the central figure in the work. Feminine and masculine shapes converge. Are we the hand in control of our destiny, or are we the mice? This painting is the painting that sort of got this show started, which my friend Joel was kind enough to loan to the museum. And it's another example of sort of asking more specific questions or more pointed questions. And here I was thinking about, there's a type of painting in Mexico called the retablo painting. And they're basically little paintings on tin that are made by common people and are sort of given as tokens of thanks for certain events. So I'll show you some examples of them in a second, but I was thinking about what it meant to give thanks with a painting or a work of art, and also what it means to be making art as something other than sort of like a narcissistic pursuit or a way that actually engages with people or engages with concerns outside of yourself. And I sort of wanted to make tribute paintings or paintings of thanks for somebody else's work rather than thanking something for my own luck or as an offering for my own thanks. So I wanted to make something that was honest to the fact that there's this separation between ourselves and the people that do work that we admire, and from people who suffer doing things that we admire. So I have a brother who's in environmental conservation. I think about him a lot and the kind of work that he does, and sort of how it's an endless battle that doesn't give back a lot. And I have also worked in that a little bit myself. Like in my 20s, I took care of a sea turtle hatchery, and this painting was inspired by a sea turtle conservationist in Costa Rica who was murdered by a drug cartel and like dragged behind a truck. And I was thinking, just a young guy, like 26 years old, and I was thinking about how to make a painting for that person or to talk about what that person did. And I think it's very hard to do that, like painting a portrait of someone or fetishizing what they look like or who they are. And to me, it seemed more like, we want to feel with those people and we want to give to those people in some way, but like we're doing that all through this sort of like mediated digital experience where there's all these layers of removal, but also still try to do that. So kind of the materiality of it and the parrot feathers in there, and the certain, the lemon is for his hometown, which is called limon, which means lemon in Spanish. So there's certain elements in there that speak of who this is for, but then it's also kind of abstracted. And I think for me, this one's for Diane Fossey, who you might be more familiar with. She died protecting gorillas in Africa. So I think for me, kind of the act of rendering something or describing something or spending a lot of time painting something is also sort of a tribute or a way to do justice to people who have come before me or to people who I'm trying to speak about. And I think doing that, like sort of trying to make an object again, connects you to the original artisan or to the person that you're talking about in a way that is locked in, like through your effort and through time and through trying to understand that object. These are the retablo paintings that I was talking about. So the one on the top left, if you translate it, says, miracle done by the saint of the column for Antonio Hernandez, who being imprisoned had no hope of release. Mrs. Trinidad Varela commended him to his divine majesty, and after 3 months and 15 days, he was released. And the other one says, I offer this retablito to the Virgin of Guadalupe for saving Don Nicolas's hand. He was cutting meat, and turning to look at my legs, he cut himself. And seeing that he wasn't getting better, I prayed for your quick help. So here, I think I'm just here I start to tie together sort of these threads of like where things come from or where imagery sort of arises and where ideas come from, and maybe that'll give you a window into sort of how my paintings start to come together. So this is a Frida Kahlo painting. Growing up in Mexico City, obviously I was like surrounded with this kind of imagery all the time. And you can see if you go to the retablo paintings, like there's aesthetic similarities there, and then also she's sort of remixing them and transforming them and adding her own narratives to them. So how do we celebrate our individuality and our ancestry while also maintaining a humanist and tentacular perspective? How do we practice joyful discontent? So joyful discontent is another thing that I've been thinking about. It's the philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti coined that. And so I've been thinking about, as someone just existing in the world right now with so many crazy things happening and with a lot of things falling apart around us, you're sort of called to action and you're called to be angry and you're called to be discontented, but there's also this like human need for joyfulness, and especially like as an artist, like I think it's very hard to connect with anyone and with an audience if you don't share some kind of joy or connection that goes beyond just being angry or like you stating your opinion or trying to change something. So I found that the idea of joyful discontent very alluring. And so I look at this idea of people all being lichens too. Again, going back to everything being a process, but lichens basically scientists have figured out are like 4 or 5 different types of organisms existing as one thing. So it's like a fungus, a plant, a bacteria, and an algae or something like that. So they keep finding out they're more and more complex. And obviously our bodies and our cells and everything are these systems as well. Donna Haraway speaks about this, and she talks about the Thulucene, which basically she says it's impossible to exist as an individual. Existing is far stranger than a bunch of individuals wandering around and interacting. This epoch is defined by the frightening weirdness of being impossibly bound up with other organisms. The identity of an individual is amorphous, porous, and liminal. There's never a clear point at which a being begins or ends. And that's why we are all lichens, a being made up of multiple separate symbiotic organisms. So when I look at other people's artwork and what's going on around me, I keep that in mind, and you can see, even like this painting that I'm showing here with the Medusa head, I didn't have this painting in my mind when I made that painting, but I was thinking about tentacularity and entanglement and sort of things being woven together in a mysterious way. And then looking back at her notes about Medusa and then looking at this painting, you start to realize these things are threaded in ways that you don't even realize. And that's sort of the magic of it, is like, even as you're working, things are coming together in very unexpected ways. Here we'll just go through a couple more paintings. So this one, it's called Huaxtepec, and it's basically in ancient Mexico, when they had ceremonies, they would often have acrobats. And they had a lot of ceremonies where they were on a lot of hallucinogenic drugs and mushrooms and such, and part of that ceremony would be these dancers and acrobats who would twist their bodies into ways that would represent plants growing and sort of elements of the natural world. So I found that really interesting and poetic, and just trying to put myself into that place and into that experience where I can imagine a human mimicking a plant and sort of paying respect to that other organism in a way that I think we see not that much of in Western society, where everything is hierarchical and people might be seen as more important than plants or smarter than plants or more conscious than plants. I think digging back into especially my native ancestry and looking at this sort of breakdown of hierarchies and sort of like levels of importance, and then bringing it back into these paintings. So this one, similarly, there's a concept in Indian philosophy called Indra's web, where they look at basically reality as being a web of things tied together with these focal points of consciousness, where consciousness sort of like comes together in a being or creature and is sort of has a greater focus. And so here I'm taking different pendants and jewelry from the museum, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and like different collections from different places, and then inserting these animal eyeballs as sort of the focal points of consciousness. I find it interesting also to take these museum objects that might not be seen by very many people anymore. A lot of them are like locked away in boxes and not in the places, not even in the parts of the museum where people would actually see them. So, and some of them are so exquisite and have so much personality and speak so much about whoever was making them, and kind of unearthing them and putting them back into paintings where you're forced to question where you are and where in time it is, and and there might be joyfulness versus, whatever setting that they would be put in their home country. I think a lot of this comes from growing up in Mexico and being from a country that's always locked in trauma and sort of being locked in despair and hopelessness and problems and corruption. I think part of the Mexican psyche as a whole is sort of to use humor and and color and ornament and all these things to pull you out of that sense of despair or trauma, which is kind of how the country started. And so unearthing these objects and putting them in joyful spaces or putting them in sort of new or futuristic places is also a way to kind of shake off a little bit of that trauma and force the viewer to look at them kind of on different terms or more personal terms. He's kind of clowny sometimes, but I like Jerry Salz recently in terms of what he's been posting about painting especially. And so one thing I like recently, he said, "Too directed a meaning in your work takes your work away from art's startlingly languageless country. To simply understand diminishes pleasure, points too narrowly. When we don't apprehend, it extends art as something to look at further. It becomes locationless. A big power of what is seen in your work is what is not seen. I call this making art in Sanskrit or hieroglyphics, things with deep content, little understanding, and great force." So I don't know, I really like that. I like deep content and little understanding struck a chord with me, because that's usually how I feel about life. So here I just put a bunch of images which also probably have been floating around my head, things that I look at a lot. The architect Luis Barragan, who's probably Mexico's most famous architect, and then Audubon and Tibetan Thangka painting, and then the reliefs and mosaics at the Alhambra in Spain, where also a lot of my ancestry comes from. Here are just two newer pieces. These one of them I showed at Armory recently, and the other one in Miami very recently. Another thing which comes up a lot is syncretism. So syncretism is basically the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. And I see Mexico really anywhere, but Mexico is such an obviously syncretic culture. There's a lot of talk lately too about decolonization, and that's something that I find also interesting, but also kind of funny and ironic at the same time, just in terms of something that has a term or a concept that has a clear value, but then also really makes no sense in a lot of ways, like being Mexican, just knowing that the clash of cultures and the assemblage of the cultures have created what is and is so irretrievably Mexican that you can't go in and sort of like pick out pieces and decide what's important and what's not to a large extent. If you ask me what institution is the most colonial, is the biggest symbol of sort of this sort of takeover of the indigenous, I would say it's the Catholic Church. And you're not going to convince many Mexicans to ditch the Catholic Church. So the project sort of falls apart before you even get on the ground. And so for me, it's more interesting, it's more fascinating to look at how these things clash together and sort of why things are the way they are, and sort of like how human knowledge and inspiration is shared. This box that's on the left is made from a dynamite box from like the 1800s, and I basically made it into a musical instrument where I put in guitar chords and an amplifier, and you can plug it in and play it. And the lyrics on the inside lid are from a mariachi song that basically talks about how fleeting and precious life is, and how basically everything is a gamble, and you can win and lose at any time. Another example of syncretism that's inspirational is the lowrider. So lowriders are basically like tricked out, ornamented cars that were invented in Southern California and like Arizona and the border region. And one thing I found really fascinating is that basically in old Mexico, they had something called the paseo, which is where the men would ride around the town square in like really decked out horses, and they would move really slowly, and kind of, it was a way to meet the women who were in the square and to like show off their horse and to, to be braggadocious and kind of like be out there. And then that sort of transferred to this culture of the lowrider, sort of going around the town square and going real slow and like basically bragging about your art form, basically, and how much you can beautify your car. And then thinking about how that goes back even further, and how if you look at these examples of syncretism, you can start to identify ways that it was used positively or ways that it was natural, and then ways that it was really imposed or sort of used as a measure of control. So another like major Mexican symbol and thing, something that's an icon that comes up again and again, is the Virgin of Guadalupe, which basically, when the Spaniards arrived in Mexico and were trying to convert the indigenous Mexicans and get them to come to church and to basically live under their structure, the indigenous people had a goddess named Coatlicue, which sounds very much like Guadalupe. Like, there's no official record that the Spanish like tried to find a saint with a similar sounding name, but to me it's kind of obvious. But they did choose this symbol basically because it was a mother goddess, and in the indigenous cultures, this sort of symbol of nature and motherly symbol was something that everybody kind of shared as one of the main icons, or one of the most important parts of kind of showing devotion and coming together. So the Spaniards really pushed this symbol of the Virgin to replace Coatlicue. But in a way, it still carries forth that tradition of sort of honoring the mother and honoring nature and being bound to nature. And I think it's really one of the things I love most about Mexico is that no matter how much culture is imposed or brought in, like these very original threads and like ways of looking at the world are still incredibly strong there, and like and still come through. And the way that they honor the Virgin of Guadalupe is a way that's very different than someone would honor a saint in Spain, or look at Catholicism in Spain. Like, and the mixing of those two things is really what gives this place such a unique substance. This is pages from the Mendoza Codex. So another fascinating thing from that period of time was the Spanish missionaries and monks who were good at drawing and painting and were used to making these manuscripts, started to document Aztec daily life and kind of catalog every little fragment of what they were seeing. So they would do their dress and their customs and the ceremonies, and basically made these incredible codices, which showed basically what was happening in Mexico City and other places when they arrived there. So it got me thinking about what our codexes are, like what our personal symbologies are, and to sort of consider my practice as a continuation of these codices, which contain elements, not only elements of my life in Mexico and the signifiers of my culture, but also just clues about my individual story and existence, and then more universally shared things. This is a quote from Donna Haraway, who I mentioned before, but she says, "It matters to destabilize worlds of thinking with other worlds of thinking." And as much as everything is sort of a process and everything is tied together and affects everything else, I think, again, it's important to sort of focus in sometimes and ask, in light of all this change and in light of all this disruption, what am I gonna care about? What am I gonna focus on? How am I gonna show generosity, or how am I gonna show connection? And how do we promote and practice and teach a kind of a joyful discontent? And how can these tentacular symbols and signifiers do something other than describe your situation? How can they be used to revolt? And Haraway makes a rare assertion that action is absolutely necessary. She says it is really important to be in revolt. We do have to practice war. We do have to be for some worlds and against others. And so I think we must not only see ourselves as lichens, but also act as lichens with agency. And this is an illustration of friars burning Aztec masks and artifacts. So again, there's this constant paradox of sort of like discord and change and one thing clashing against another thing, but also understanding that they're all intrinsically tied together and affecting each other all the time, and trying to balance those two modes of being where you have to be for things, but also understand how they come together. And that's it.
Thank you, Christian. I think we have time for a couple of questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I'll bring the microphone over to you. Okay.
You can probably hear me. Have you published any of your poetry?
So actually, the past few months was the first time I ever tried to do that, and I got the first two published, which I was super happy about, and then the second two were not accepted. And right now, I'm kind of at a point where I already deal with so much like rejection and acceptance as a painter, and like I already have to deal with that emotionally so much, where I'm like, do I really want to add another thing like this? But yeah, I don't know. I'll probably keep trying to get them out there. I think it's nice to have other people read them.
Where does size play a role in how you begin the creative process? Just curious.
Yeah, sure. I think it comes from a lot of different things. A lot of the very tiny pieces I started doing in grad school as really a very practical thing, because I had been working with like feathers and big objects and sculpture and plaster, and it was really hard to make those kind of works and then have critique in grad school, where I can maybe make one of those per semester and then would have to all talk about it over and over. So I was like, it'll be better if I just make really small paintings, and then we have a set of things and ideas can kind of evolve and I can work through things. So I think it's just from working very tight and slow, it was a way for me to make more things. And then sometimes it just has to do with the space that I'm in, like the kind of studio that I'm able to work in. Right now my foot's busted, so I can't really do anything very large. So I've been working again sort of on a medium scale that I can work on at my desk. But I've always liked to see a range of different work and to see how those started to talk to each other, and like mistake making and also surprise and giving the material some agency has always been productive for me. So if I go from very small to very big, it opens up a whole new set of challenges and a whole new way of having to maybe draw it beforehand or to consider the space, and that like shakes me out of my own habits. So that's always part of it.
If you could use the microphone, because we have a video.
Could you say something briefly about your journey from Mexico to the United States, and maybe the influence that journey had on your art, how that worked?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I've always really felt like I've lived in between places. I think I was around 8 years old, I think, when I moved from Mexico. So I was sort of old enough to have somewhat of a Mexican identity and character and upbringing, and to be imbued with all these things about Mexico that still come out. But then I was also young enough that I've also never felt completely Mexican. And I remember being in the U.S. and not speaking a word of English and just being tossed in school, and like dealing with the bullying that happens because of that and the lack of connection, and sort of, I think that's formed a big part of who I am and what I make, and even why I'm an artist. It's sort of like this need or this feeling that I want to communicate with people, but talking to them is maybe not the best way to do it. So I think that's been a big influence, and I think. Just in terms of like being someone who's from a country that has a very different root, like a very, emotionally it's a very different place. It's a place that's like incredibly joyous and boisterous and colorful and complex and sort of very maximalist, but also sort of, as Octavio Paz is one of my favorite writers, and he talks about how solitude is one of the defining aspects of the Mexican character, and it sort of comes from this place of disconnect where colonialism happened, and there was this sort of loss for both of those cultures, and there's been this constant attempt to like reclaim the original character of the land and the connection to the place, which sort of can never happen because of this takeover, but also like the people who came from Spain are also separated from their homeland, so there's this constant sort of solitude or melancholy that's also sort of part of the national character. And I think the way he talks about the fact that Mexicans release that solitude through partying and through big families and sort of loudness and like exploding every once in a while. Like I think he talks about it being sort of like a firework where everything is sort of contained and then it like explodes, which is very different from how he talks about the American character. And I find that when I read his books, I find myself really torn between the two places where I feel very American in a lot of ways and I grew up in New England, which is like almost the polar opposite to Mexico culturally. And like, you know, like New England people are tight and they stay in their own families and like it's really hard to break into the circle. But then when you're in the circle, it's like super warm and people are very real. And it's, you know, very different from the Midwest too, where like, you know, everybody talks to each other here and there's this like open friendliness. Like New England, everybody's an asshole until you know them. And Mexico's not like that. Like Mexico's like everybody's pretty friendly. So yeah, I just find it fascinating to like have these different parts of my character like always kind of at odds with each other, but like sort of trying to look at them as means of creating new things and sort of like bringing people together, being able to talk to different groups of people. Thank you.